You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in.
a Mamamia podcast.
Just a warning, in this episode of No Filter, we will be touching briefly on the issue of suicide. If you need help, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14. Lots of people have two jobs. By day, they work in retail, and at night, maybe they drive an Uber. My guest today also had two jobs for a while in her 20s and 30s, and they involved pole dancing and death. From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, an interview podcast with people who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. Like so many little girls, when Emma Jane Holmes was growing up, her dream job was to work in the funeral industry. I know, right? But it's true, and it's just fascinating. I've never met anyone who's quite like Emma Jane. She radiates, what is it? It's like a sort of sunshiny calm. She's exactly the person that you would like to knock on your door on one of the worst days of your life, when someone that you loved had just died and their body needed to be taken to the mortuary. She's a real carer. She's got a very caring energy about her. And that's always what she wanted to do. She wanted to take care of people. Specifically, she wanted to take care of them after they died, at a time when they could no longer take care of themselves. So she went and trained as a mortician. But what does that actually involve? What does a mortician do? And then the part where she started working in the adult industry at the same time as working as a mortician, well, I'm going to let her tell you that bit. I want to start a little bit in the middle of your story, which is on a night, or maybe it's a day, that you're driving with a box next to you and you get a phone call about a celebrity. Can you tell me that story?
So I just remember the polarity of my life in that moment. I had all of my bikini waitressing gear in the car with me, fake tan, hairspray, bikinis, but I was in my suit transporting somebody's brain to the funeral home. I remember...
Why just their brain?
Because they had passed away due to suspicious circumstances and they'd had an autopsy. So the service had already been conducted. They were cremated already, but the brain still needed further testing. So part of our role is to then collect the brain and then cremate that also to go with the rest of the body. Every part of your body goes with you, even if you did have an autopsy. So that is why I had Mr. Stephen's brain next to me. And I remember thinking that scene was odd enough to then have my boss call me and say, oh, by the way, we have a party this weekend and Brad Pitt might be there. And I just thought, what is my life? This is crazy. And that was a common, working in the adult industry, that actually happened quite a lot. I'd be, fixing somebody who just passed away while looking up rosters for bikini waitressing shifts. It was just something that happened quite a lot for me.
When you say fixing up somebody who'd passed away, what do you mean?
So it does depend on how somebody passed away, but there's a lot involved. A lot of people think the work of a mortician is just the makeup or, the hot rollers in the hair, but there's a lot involved. So it can include bathing the body, it can be wrapping them in bandages, fixing wounds, stitching, unstitching. Yes, there's a great deal of work that goes behind the doors of the mortuary.
And is that even if there's a closed casket?
Absolutely. So every single person that we care for is prepared as if they're going to have a viewing, because a viewing may take place. You never know. Grandpa Joe might just suddenly decide at the last minute, I really want to see my wife. And we will never say no.
Does that happen?
Yes.
So people are like, no, I don't want to see the body, and then they change their mind.
Yeah, that's happened quite a lot. Some funeral homes won't allow it just because of the effort it can take. Taking the lid off the coffin and then screwing it back down. It can be a big job, but we're not supposed to say no. So you want everybody to look amazing. And it's just respect as well. Every funeral director cares for the dead as if it's their own parent.
Do you remember the first dead body that you saw?
I do. She was a little old lady and she looked just like my nan. She looked just like a mannequin, lying in her coffin, so peaceful, but she looked fake. Her skin was just porcelain-like and just so beautiful that it just didn't look like a human lying there. It was really quite confronting.
How old were you?
I would have been 23.
What were you doing working in a mortuary at age 23?
A lot of funeral directors will say this, and it's quite cliche. It's a job that you're drawn to. It's not something you wake up and decide, I want to be a mortician. It's something that you've been drawn to a long time. So even as a kid, I was drawn to it. I would go play in cemeteries while kids played in the park. So it was just something I always wanted to do. So to be there in that mortuary that day was a dream come true. It wasn't morbid to me. It was a dream come true.
When you played in cemeteries, do you remember what it was that attracted you to that world?
Their stories. I loved the old headstones because very often it would have the story of their life, like where they were born, how they passed. You used to say killed in an accident or killed by drowning. You don't see that anymore, but they were the headstones. I just make up stories about their life. Yeah, I think that's what drew me to the cemetery.
When did it first occur to you that you could work in that industry and that there were people whose job it was to work with the dead?
The very first time I attended a funeral, which was my nan's, so I would have been about 8 years old, and I remember watching the funeral directors by the hearse, and they just looked so beautiful, and I thought they were brave because they weren't crying. Everybody around me was crying, and they weren't. And I thought, wow, they're so strong. What do they do now? Because they hopped in the hearse and drove away. And I thought, where have they gone off to? I need to do that. So, yeah, the very first time I ever went to a funeral, I wanted to be a part of it.
And so how did you become a part of it?
It took a long time. The funeral industry is very hard to get into. There's a saying in the industry, someone's got to die for you to get the job, because once you become a funeral director or a mortician...
Humour. Is that like funeral humour?
You just don't want to leave the job once you get you. So I literally knocked on funeral home doors until someone opened it and said, come on in.
See, I would have thought that it would be a really hard job to find people who wanted to do it.
Yes, there's so many teams. So there are certain jobs that maybe are harder to fill. Like actually when I worked in a smaller funeral home, I learned how hard it is to get people to do certain parts of the job. But overall, there's so many people that want to know what goes on and apply for jobs, and they don't last very long because it's confronting.
So do you mean people kind of romanticize it a little bit, or they're just curious and then they get in and they're like, ooh.
And they don't realise how much hard work's involved. Sorry, that's an assumption, but in my experience, I've heard people say, I didn't know it involved this. So it involves jumping in the car at 1 a.m. and hitting the road and going to what we call a transfer, and you'll be out on the road for 5 hours a night, and then you've got to work the next day as well. And that's just part of the job. It's really hard work.
Tell me about transfers. Firstly, what is a transfer?
Sure. So a transfer is taking the person from place of death into the care of the funeral home.
And what kind of places do people die?
Places that you could not even imagine. I was blessed to work for a funeral home that had the police contract, so that was a whole other world in itself, because we would go to, unfortunate, all cases are unfortunate, but particularly.
So that meant that you would go to crime scenes?
Yes, and suicides and murders and car accidents and things like that. But most funeral homes are, nursing homes, rocking chairs, beds, gardens, under the stairs, basements. Wherever they took their last breath, we have to get in there and get them out.
See, I would have thought that when someone dies at home or in a public place that you call an ambulance and that the ambulance takes the body away. Is that not the case?
Most people do think that, and it is usually the first people that people call. And yes, you can definitely do that. But in the end, it is us that come. So they will declare life extinct, do the paperwork, and call us.
So you get the call, and it might be in the middle of the night, it might be in the middle of the day. What do you psychologically and physically do to prepare to go into that situation?
It's quite absurd, the strength I used to find within. I can't undo the lid on a jar of soup, but I can lift a body off the floor in the middle of the night with no sleep. It's just this strength comes from within. I don't know where it comes from. It's like you turn into superhuman. And then you put them in the mortuary fridge and you hop back in your own car and you think, what did I just do? Like, how did I just do that? So it's almost like there's no preparation you can do because you don't know what you're walking into.
What are some of those scenes that you've walked into?
I've walked into a suicide where the gentleman didn't want to make a mess on the carpet, so he was in the shower cubicle. That was very touching for me because it was in his bedroom that he shared with his wife and his books were on the bedside. His cologne was on the vanity and there he was in the shower. And I just remember recovering him from the cubicle and putting him on the stretcher and there's just so much going on around you. You've got police officers, you've got so much to think of and then you've just got to take them to the hospital as if it never happened at all. And that was one that stuck with me. I have walked into bedrooms where mothers don't want to let go of their babies. I've literally carried babies from mothers' arms and it's just so heartbreaking.
How do you walk into a house of grief like that?
It's almost like a blessing. I know it sounds really weird. I feel so grateful when I'm there because I can help them in some way, but it just reminds me how lucky I am. Like I complain a lot about the most stupidest things, but when you walk into that situation, you were just so grateful and you just realise, wow, like I made it past that age. I'm an adult. I survived and that's not my family member. I'm going to call them and say hello. It just reminded you how lucky you are.
When you walk into a house, I imagine that people are in shock in many cases. How do you navigate their feelings about the person that they've lost? But you've got a job to do and I imagine you're on a schedule and you sort of have to say, I've got to take them with me. How do you navigate all of that?
By the time we arrive, the family have gone through so much that usually they want to see the back of us. You know, we're the scary guys. They don't want to talk to us too much and they just know this is it. So quite often it's quite quick. Sometimes you'll have someone fall into your arms and hug you and cry and sometimes you will just stay an extra half hour. Sometimes we'll have a cup of tea with them. There is no time frame, especially in the middle of the night when you haven't got work to go back to. There's been times I've sat at a kitchen table while a guy was downing his Forex golds. That's happened before. You've got to be their friend and make them feel safe. So it just comes natural. It's really hard to explain, but all funeral directors are the same. It comes out of nowhere. It's just something that happens, you know, you need to do it and it's your job to make them feel like they're being taken care of.
So once you transfer that person back to the mortuary, what happens then?
There's a lot. There's a lot of paperwork.
Paperwork?
Yes,
what kind of paperwork?
well, there's a joke. I'll never forget being at a Christmas party and once someone said to a colleague of mine, what's the scariest thing you've ever seen as a funeral director? And they responded with paperwork because the paperwork is paramount and it has to be spot on.
No one tells you about the admin.
Oh my God. And again,
involved.
that's one of the things that people don't realise. And suddenly as a funeral director, you've got to fill out all these forms in the middle of the night. And if there's one digit that's incorrect,
But what are on the forms?
So all of that will be sent to create the death certificate, but it's also so the funeral can be arranged correctly. There's birth dates, there's addresses, there's what was the person wearing, right down to their socks. What colour were their socks? What colour was the ring on their finger? Was there anything that they would like to be buried with? All of this is done before the funeral arrangement.
So is that done between you collecting the body? Like when you collect the body, do you take the clothes that they're going to wear
Yes.
and you do all of that
Yes.
at the same time?
Yes. A lot of the time the family would have already organised that. Some family they haven't even thought about that.
'Cause it was
so,
sudden.
Yeah, so they'll bring that in at a later date. But we do all of that paperwork and we put it in a plastic sleeve, put the body away in the mortuary fridge. We pop that paperwork into a little tray, I guess you could say, for our boss the next day, and the funeral arrangements begin.
You're listening to No Filter with me, Mia Friedman, and Emma Jane Holmes. What does a mortuary smell like?
an empty freezer when you defrost it, but you may have had some meat in there that hadn't been found for a while. But also there's a smell of flowers and there's a smell of tyre shine because of the hearses. There's a smell of pine wood. All of that mixed together.
The coffins.
Yes, creates the fragrance of a funeral home, but it's actually quite beautiful. Yeah, it's so many different facets of the funeral home that you can smell.
I imagine that you are called to transfer bodies at different stages after they've died. So sometimes I imagine it's quite soon. Are there times that you can think of when it's been a while after?
Yes, definitely. Summer is not our friend. A lot of cases I have gone to in the middle of summer where someone was not found for a long time. There's been times where I've transferred, I didn't know if it was a man or a woman. A lot of people will also drive out into the middle of nowhere when they've made that decision. So they may not have been found for a month and there's not much left after that.
What is left?
More than you'd think, more than I thought, more than I expected.
Does it look
But
in
it's
any way
quite-
like a person?
It
still?
does, but something from a horror film. Like, it's really hard to explain, but it's not nice. And depending on the environment, were there animals around? How did they do it? Yeah.
And so what are some of the considerations that you have to think of in terms of transferring a body and getting it back to the funeral home?
Mess. Sadly, they're not going to be the only person we collect that day. So we need to ensure that we stay clean and also the van stays clean because you may be going to a sweet old lady's house next. So you need to make sure that you use a plastic body bag to conceal the mess. I've made mistakes where I haven't grabbed a plastic one and I've grabbed a cotton body bag, which isn't the most ideal situation to find yourself in. You need to make sure you have the correct stretcher. There's lots of different stretchers. You want to make sure you have gloves. Do you need your PPE wear? Have you got a pen? And are you awake? They're the main things.
And then what needs to be done when you get back to the mortuary? So you filled in your paperwork. They're in the freezer.
Yeah, the cool room.
The cool room.
We measure them. They need a special coffin. So a really tall person will need a special coffin ordered. We call that an oversize. Most funeral homes don't have many of those in stock. So if they are oversized, we need to order one pronto. So that's one of the main things. Always must place the head not lying on the side at all because that can cause blood pooling and that can't be reversed. Make sure they're comfortable. We always put lotion on their skin, on their hands and on their face to ensure no fridge burn. Make sure their skin stays nice and hydrated. Put pot puree in their hands. Yeah, we tuck it in their hands and close across their chest.
What happens to the human body, Emma Jane, after you die, just generally?
We begin to break down. Rigor mortis does relax naturally, but usually we're preparing the body prior to that time frame, so we will have to relieve that ourselves. So we will do a bit of a massage of the ligaments and a hot soapy bath helps relieve that as well. But if you weren't to be prepared, rigor mortis would relax naturally.
After how long?
About 2 days, 3 days. But it does depend on how the person passed away. So sometimes if the person had been doing something quite strenuous beforehand, also depends on the disease as well. Then
Have you ever had to transfer someone who died during sex?
No, I haven't.
Oh.
I haven't, but I've heard about it. I've heard so many stories. Funeral directors always share their stories and I never ever came across
What kind
that.
of stories do they share? Like what ranks as something that you would share with another funeral director? Or some that you've heard maybe?
Oh goodness, so many. There was a man who enjoyed arcade simulators to watch his adult movies and he got stuck in there. So he was transferred with a sexual device still attached and enjoying his favourite movie. People passing away on the toilet is a big one.
Is there a type of transfer or body preparation that you really dread or conversely that you really enjoy?
I loved transfers. They were my favourite part of the job. There was no transfers I didn't enjoy, but funny enough, I never looked forward to the nursing home transfers. You would think they'd be the most straightforward one, but they're actually not, because there's multiple entrances. They're dark. There's so many empty corridors and so many rooms, and you're wandering around at 3 a.m. Where am I going? Am I going to go into the right room? I did not look forward to those calls.
Something I learnt from your book is that people don't die with their eyes closed.
Yeah, that's actually a misconception. A lot of people think that we die peacefully with our eyes beautifully closed and soft. Sometimes that can be the case, but most of the time the eyes are partially open.
So what do you have to do?
We use a little bendy piece of plastic. It's oval shaped and we call that an eye cap. So we slip that in under the eyelid and that keeps the eyelid closed.
And what about the mouth? Is the mouth open generally when people die?
Yes.
So what do you do about that?
That's an art form. That was my favourite part of the job, to put a smile back on somebody's face, literally. We use needles and thread, yes, so we sew it closed.
Emma Jane, how did you learn these things?
I had some beautiful trainers. They were amazing. They taught me all the tricks of the trade and they created me into the mortician I became. It's on the job. You receive so much theory work. You can do that until the sun comes up, but you need to do it because the path that the needle goes, you need to practice that over and over again. It's not something you can just look at a picture and go, oh yeah, I got that. You need to do it.
Did you have to sort of unlearn the reflex of thinking that you were going to hurt someone?
Yes. It took me a very long time, a good year probably, to remember I'm not hurting them. So if the needle wasn't quite going where I wanted it to go, my blood would run cold and I'm so sorry, mate, I didn't mean to hurt you. And I wouldn't do the best job I could do because I was so gentle, and which you still are gentle, but you learn how to use a firmer hand and get the job done quickly and correct.
As a mortician, are you sort of assigned, okay, here's this person, you need to make them open casket ready even if they're not having an open casket? And do you then just go to work for a period of hours by yourself, or how does it work?
Depending on how big the funeral home is, but yes, most funeral homes there's about 3 morticians in the same room, 3 mortuary tables, and you just go down a list basically of whose funeral's first down to whose funeral's on Thursday. And you just go down the list and prepare, go into the call room, take them out, prepare them, put them in the coffin, and you put them in line ready to go for the day is really how it works. As awful as it sounds, but when you're working in a big funeral home, it's like that. A small funeral home, which I was so blessed to experience, I was the only mortician and I was alone by myself all day, every day, in a little room preparing my bodies by myself. And I really enjoyed that because it was country. I knew some of the people because it was a small town, and I could take my time, and I didn't have anyone breathing down my neck saying, you've got 45 minutes, hurry up. I could take 2 hours and curl their hair beautifully, and that was my favourite time.
What's your relationship with the people during the time that you're preparing their bodies? Do you imagine what their stories are, or do you try to find out their stories? Do you look at pictures of them when they were alive to get a sense of how you should make them look?
Yes, and sometimes it's almost like they tell you. I remember a lady I prepared, she had this long cascading brunette mane of curls, and she arrived after her autopsy. It was in a plait to the side, and something told me that's not how she wears her hair. I didn't have a photo. I didn't have anything to go by. It was a sad death, and something told me, it was like she was inside of me saying, that's not how I wear my hair. So I rang her daughter and said, would you mind if I fanned her hair out across her shoulder? She's got beautiful hair. She goes, that's exactly how she wore it. It's as if she told you how she wants her hair. So I would talk to her and say, thank you for that. And others you would just have to guess. You'd follow the parting in the hair, and you could also see on their lips where their mouth sat, where your lips sit. So sometimes you just had to follow your instincts. Other times, yes, you'd have photos. Sometimes I'd talk to them. I had no one else to talk to. Other times I'd get angry at them if they were a young boy who had just taken his own life. What were you doing? What were you thinking? I'd have those conversations with them. probably quite odd to most people, but
No, I
had
think it
conversations with them all the time.
Thinking about if it was your loved one, like that's lovely. What I've never forgotten the story about Paula Yates going to see Michael Hutchins in the mortuary after he passed, and she was in London and she flew out, and I think she gave an interview where she talked about seeing him and just being worried that he was cold and going out and buying a doona. So thinking that someone was talking to them still as though they were a person.
Absolutely, they do. And I've done the same before. And that's beautiful. That's such a beautiful story. It's quite often that mothers will provide a blanket or their favourite toy. And I always tuck a towel in around them sometimes. I just think, oh, it must be cold. For the first year, I used to think, oh, they must be so cold. But over time, you realise they're somewhere else, which is probably very warm and like paradise, I'm sure. So that eventually leaves you. But at all times, they're respected and cared for. I knew a mortician who, if the body was in no state to be viewed, she would still place the clothes over them as if they were wearing them, which was really sweet. And no one is ever going to see him again. She didn't have to do that. So I love the public to know how much funeral directors care for the dead, probably more than living people. I know I went through a stage where living people annoyed me. So we care for the dead more than we care for live people sometimes.
When it was a cause of death that you maybe didn't know, or there was a story that you didn't know, maybe a crime situation or maybe a young person, were you able to find out the story, a little bit about that person's life or the circumstances of their death, or was that something you always knew?
A lot of the time you would know because of what you could see with your eye, but you get a coroner's report, yes, and it will have cause of death and it will be written there if you can't see it with your eye.
Did you ever wonder about their life?
All the time, absolutely. I have books and books at home of stories I've written about people's lives that I've come across.
That you mean you've made up?
Yes,
Yeah.
and I also always took one of the leaflets because we printed those ourselves.
That they have at the funeral?
Yes.
Where it has like photos of them?
Yes, and I used to collect them as a way of remembering them, and I have hundreds of them, and I flick through them sometimes and remember their life and pay respects to the life that they had all the time.
Did you ever get queasy?
Never. No. Probably one time, I think it's in the book, my very first decomposition case. But that was the one and only time where I actually felt nauseous and icky. But it just became natural, I guess.
So the other side of your life, being the adult industry, how did that come about?
It came about because of shitty circumstances. But again, when I was a little girl, I did always want to dance. I saw the movie Showgirls when I was a little kid.
Classic.
Yes, and I remember the glitter and the lean legs and the tricks, and I just thought that is so cool. I wrote a list, I remember, of all the things I needed to do to become a showgirl. I needed to have big hair, I needed to have a great tan, and this was when I was 12 years old. So it was something I always wanted to do. I wanted to
While you were playing in the cemeteries.
Yeah, it's very weird. I was a
made
weird
your
child. I was a weird kid.
I love it.
But then, sadly, circumstances led me to the adult industry, and I'm so glad it did because there's no way I would have just randomly become a dancer. So I'm so glad that that shitty time happened.
What was the shitty time?
I went through a terrible divorce. It was horrible. And I started from scratch. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to do this on a mortician's wage. So that's what led me to the strip club.
And what was that like?
I loved it.
Did you?
I loved it. There's so many different perceptions of it, and I think it depends on the reason why you're there. But because I was there, because I loved it, I had so much fun. I don't think I had a bad night where I went home crying. There'd be some nights where you think, oh, I wish I made more money. I spent more on getting ready than what I made. But I never came across terrible clients. I was saying to a friend only today that I think I've had worse experiences just in everyday life than I ever did at the strip club. I had so much fun.
What did you have to do as part of your job there?
I was an exotic dancer, a lap dancer. So basically I just walk around all night with not much on and perform lap dances, perform stage shows, talk. There's a whole lot of talking that goes on.
I
Oh
thought
my
that
goodness.
men went to those clubs because they didn't want to talk. They just wanted to like look and
So did
ogle
I. I was exhausted by the end of it.
What do they want to talk about?
Everything. Themselves, mainly.
Ah.
But it was interesting. So I was having interesting stories coming at me from both the day job and the night job. Like, these guys were pretty interesting guys.
Were they trying to impress you?
Probably.
Yeah.
I probably had rose-coloured glasses on going, oh, this is so cool, this is so glamorous. So probably most of the time I think they just wanted someone to talk to because they may not have had that in their personal lives. Yeah, they probably did, but they didn't realise that they did.
Who were some of the women that you met that you danced alongside?
They're such queens. They're so beautiful. So I danced alongside mothers, students, makeup artists, hairdressers, grandmas. I've met a grandma. Just the most beautiful women.
So there's no sort of type of woman?
No.
They're probably saying there was a mortician that I danced with.
Yeah, they're just, when I went into the industry, I thought I needed the big boobs and the blonde hair, but there is all shapes, all ages, all colours of the rainbow. It's just no type at all.
What did you learn about men?
They're so easily pleased. So easily pleased.
What does it take?
Just flutter your eyelashes and put your hand on their arm, and you've made their day.
Really?
Yes. I learnt about men. They're pretty boring. They think money's important. Women don't think money's that important that I worked with. That's not the main reason why we were dancers that I experienced.
I would have thought that the reason that, you mentioned grandmothers and mothers and uni students, I would have imagined that they were all doing it for the money.
Definitely, but it's more the money in a shorter amount of time. So the money you would make in a night, then you could study for the rest of the week, or you could be a mum for the rest of the week, or a mortician for the rest of the week. So you'd make a week's wage in the night. I mean, yes, it's good money, but it's more for me the time frame. I could make $1,000 in one night and then I don't have to worry about money again. That's what it felt like for me.
How did it make you feel about your body?
I wish I appreciated it more back then because I look at photos, I think, damn, I looked all right compared to now. It makes you so fit and healthy. You're dancing, it's such a great workout. And I just learned that all our bodies are the same, like naked, side by side with other women, we're the same. I don't know why we fuss about it so much. It's just a body. But I think working in death gave me that mindset because I saw it in so many different stages. So to me, it wasn't a commodity. Like, it was nothing to me. It was just a body. Whereas a lot of women fussed about it so much and went to such measures to ensure their body was perfect. And the guys didn't care about that. They just wanted to talk to you.
Are you still involved in the adult industry and the death industry?
No, so I haven't stepped inside. I kind of miss it. I was in bed at 6:30 last night thinking I'd only just be doing my makeup to go to work. I haven't been in a strip club or a funeral home now for about a year.
What took you from the industries?
For the adult industry, I felt like I was getting a bit old. But there's some women who carry on dancing well into their 40s, let me just say.
Yeah, you
but
just
they're
said.
beautiful. I don't have that kind of motivation to work out and eat healthy. So mainly I just felt a bit old. I was getting tired. And the death industry, I just felt like it was time to help the living. So I really wanted to do a job where I could prevent them reaching the funeral home. So I went into mental health. If I could just save one person from reaching the mortuary, that was my end goal, I think.
And so what are you doing now?
So I'm working as a mental health support worker. So just helping them get back out into the community after they've had a really bad time.
Do you remember your best day at work in the death industry?
This is so cliche, but every single day, there was not one bad day. We have that motto where you say, if you find a job you love, you don't work a day in your life. That's how it felt. But I think the best day was my very first day as a conductor. I was promoted to a funeral conductor, which means you lead the show. So you are at the front of the chapel when you lead the pallbearers down to the front of the church and back to the hearse. And I was allocated the biggest funeral of the day. And I thought, do they know what they're doing here? They've just allocated Emma Jane the biggest funeral of the day. And when we were walking back to the hearse, everyone stood up to their feet and started clapping their hands. And it was this huge applause. And everybody was just clapping for this gentleman that had died, and they were saying, "Well done, mate, good job." I get goosebumps thinking about it. And it was the most beautiful experience to close the back of the hearse with everybody clapping and cheering for this guy. And I just thought it was like the curtain closing on a life, and that stuck with me, definitely.
Thanks so much, Emma Jane.
Thank
Your book's
you.
fantastic. It's been so lovely to meet you. I can see what
Thank
you brought to your
you.
job and how lucky the people who worked with you were to work with you.
Thank you for having me in your beautiful studio, and thank you for wearing the sparkles.
Always for you, my friend.
Gorgeous.
Well, that was a story, wasn't it? Oh, I obviously had so many questions, and she just, do you know what I mean about her sunshiny calm that I mentioned at the beginning? Could you kind of hear that in her voice? She's sort of almost ethereal. And I can just see how she would have been able to give great comfort to people during those really awful times after they've lost a loved one or were traumatised. You can read an extract from Emma Jane's book on mamamia.com.au. There's a link in the show notes. And if you want to buy her book, it's called One Last Dance, My Life in Mortuary Scrubs and G-Strings. And it is also available via a link in our show notes. If you're after more podcasts, more videos, and more Mamamia, why not become an M+ member? It's Mamamia's membership program for our superfans. Head to mamamia.com.au/M+ to find out more. Lucy Neville is the assistant producer of No Filter. The executive producer is Elissa Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on Mamamia.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.